Hey there, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of the State of Greater Western New York Report. You see that map behind me? It's nice and easy and very organized, but it's not what the redistricting map looks like for the congressional seats that's coming up. We're going to find out why it happened that way and if anybody's trying to do anything about it on this week's episode of the State of Greater Western New York Report, which of course is brought to you each week by... Each week, our community makes history. Each week, you make history. And each week, there's only one source to turn to for the first take on history. You know what that is? Subscribe to the Sentinel right now to discover the history being made in your own backyard.
The Mendon Honeoye Falls Lima Sentinel. More than just your news, it's your history. Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the State of Greater Western New York Report. Join us each episode as we discuss fantastic topics ranging from history to science to the strange and the wonderful, as well as the treasured spirit with which our region has infused America. We challenge you to consider all things Greater Western New York, from our region's very beginnings to how it inspires, how it empowers, and why it is so admired. Here's the host of the State of Greater Western New York Report, Chris Carosa.
Hello and welcome everyone to this week's episode of the State of Greater Western New York Report. With me today is Mark Johns. He is the former New York State Assemblyman who actually helped try to solve this problem of redistricting several years ago when he was serving in the Assembly. Mark, welcome today. How are you doing?
Great, Chris. Thanks for having me on your show.
Well, tell us a little bit. First of all, before we get into this, I always ask people to tell us a little bit about their background. Just very quickly, who are you? Where'd you come from? And what are you doing? That sort of thing.
Well, sure. I'm a lifelong Webster resident. I worked in public health for 30-something years, and then I served in the New York State Assembly for 10 years. And this particular redistricting bill came up, and unfortunately, it passed, but it passed with almost unanimous support because we didn't have an alternative. So we had to hope that this independent commission would actually draw independent lines that the Senate and Assembly would have to vote on. But as it turned out, the devil's in the details. You read the bill, and all they had to do in the state legislature was vote down these independent redistricting lines twice, and then they go back to the old ways of gerrymandering the districts, and that's what you saw.
Well, before we get into
Yeah.
that, let's get into a little bit of the history, because you were actually involved in the creation of this independent panel, in crafting what eventually became this independent panel. Can you tell us a little bit about, what was the motive behind doing that, and how did that creation process occur? And then we can talk about how it failed this time around.
Well, the push came from a former New York City mayor named Ed Koch, okay? And he had, in 2010 when I ran, he had everybody sign on to an agreement. I think 85% of the officials signed on to an agreement. He called it New York Uprising, and he wanted independent redistricting. I did as well. The final bill that came up that we passed in 2014 and allowed the public to vote on wasn't really independent redistricting. As I said, Ross Perot says the devil's in the details, and being allowed to vote the district lines down twice and then go back to the gerrymandering old ways is not what the people wanted. But in those days, the Senate was controlled by the Republicans. So there was a slight possibility that the Democrats in the Assembly and the Senate Republicans could at least cobble together some independent redistricting for the congressional level. Since then, the Democrats have taken over the Senate, and it's one-party rule in this state. And, they were going to vote those bills, the new district lines down at least once or twice, and that's what they did. And now we got, within a week later, this is the leap of faith. Within a week after voting down the districts, all of a sudden they got new ones. They probably had those in the back room being drawn up months ago.
Well, let's take a look at what these new districts look like on the congressional side. Now, I know they did both the Assembly and the State Senate. Well, let's look at the congressional side first, because this is what's getting a lot of the airplay. you can see these are the new districts. Use the new districts. Now, New York State lost a representative because of the new census came out and we didn't have enough people to maintain what we used to have. So, as a part of this, they redrew one of the lines, and in particular, we're looking at District 24, which goes from Niagara County all the way up to Watertown, and embedded within that is District 25, which includes the entirety of Monroe County. Can you just explain to the audience what was the Democrats' motivation for drawing the maps like this? And I know that there's issues downstate too, but we want to focus on just within the Western New York region.
Well, basically, that is the Northern Dumpster District. They carve out districts that favor Democrats, and then the leftovers, which in this Northern District is number 24, stretches from Niagara Falls up to Watertown. That is 4 different metro areas. That is 4 different commercial, media areas. And it's pretty hard for somebody without money to run in 4 different media zones. And the Southern District is, the Southern Dumpster District, which is all the leftover Republicans down in the Southern tier. And that's just the way they do it. So there are about 4 districts in New York State that are packed with Republicans. And if you're in a Republican district, the only thing that counts is going to be the Republican primary. And you can see the other blue and darker blue districts are going to be Democrats, and maybe the Democrats will have primaries in their district.
Now, one of the things, and we'll go back to the map in a second, but one of the things that I noticed when I saw this map is Monroe County now is contained within 1 congressional seat, and it hasn't been that way for a long, long time. Historically, there had been 2 congressional seats within Monroe County, and if you see, let's go back to the map here. In Erie County, there's multiple districts. You can't really tell the county lines here, but that's the way it's been. So the risk to the county, if you're in only 1 district and you happen to vote in a congressman who ends up being in the minority, how does that hurt that county?
Well, if we have a Democrat representing Monroe County and the House of Representatives goes Republicans, we may not be as represented as well as maybe a majority member. And it's going to be very close after this election. A lot of people are predicting the Republicans are going to take back the House of Representatives, but having a member or maybe 2 members, 1 in each party, that's why a lot of states like to have a Republican senator and a Democratic senator, so they cover both U.S. Senate seats.
Yeah, so that's absolutely true on the Senate side as well. But you see now obviously the argument about having a single seat within a county, if you look at the 23rd across the southern tier there, that's several counties served by 1 congressman, and you're stuck with whatever party. So if it's usually a Republican leaning district, and if the Democrats control the House, then obviously there's a problem there. But to the extent that they could solve that, I mean, they're not even looking. That's not. What's their motivation? Why are they doing this? Why are the Democrats in New York State doing this?
Well, I hate to tell you, but I think the Republicans might be doing it in other states, but they make these districts so extremely Republican and extremely Democrat that most people, and 60 to 80% of the people, are somewhere in the middle, and they're not really represented by either extreme. But the career politicians, and I'm talking about the politicians who are against term limits. This is another good reason for term limits. If you had a 12-year term limit, then the people in these districts, if they've already served 10 years or 8 years or whatever, it's not going to be so important to get a gerrymandered district because you're going to be out of there in a couple of years, right? But when the only thing you care about is getting reelected and reelected and reelected, you're going to want to pick your voters. And that, coupled with the fact that the incumbents can raise all kinds of money, and I'm talking about special interest money from the lobbyists and the influence peddlers, without term limits, you can be there as long as you want. I mean, we've seen a lot of politicians, career politicians, dying in office.
That's right. And now, so let's let's talk about on the Senate side and the Assembly side of New York State. Start with the Senate side. How have the seats changed, as far as you know, within there?
Well, I still think there's obviously a big advantage for the Democrats, and they made it more that way. The Democrats have pointed out that this is a state that is 2-to-1 Democrat, so they feel they should have a 2-to-1 majority. But why not, have independent redistricting, and then if you get a 2-to-1 majority, so be it. At least people have a choice. But there's certain people in rural areas are going to vote one way. Certain people in urban areas are going to vote another way. And we don't seem to come together. And the test of it is 10 years ago, we lost 2 congressional seats. This time around, we lost 1. Carolina's picking up a congressional seat, right? So we have younger people that we pay more for public education than any other state. And some of our best and brightest are going down to Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill, North Carolina, the Research Triangle Park. We paid for their education. They're going down south. So, we see a lot of that. So young people that are going to the Carolinas for jobs, older people that are going to Florida to retire, they are the states that are picking up seats. And we are the state that is losing seats.
So within the state, there's an issue of just, the Senate used to be Republican, and
Right.
and it shifted slightly over to the Democrats. How does the new Senate redistricting really solidify what the Democrat hold is?
Well, when you have a 2-to-1 majority, and hopefully the Republicans will pick up some seats to at least make it less than 2/3. The big shift is that if the governor vetoes something, they don't have the ability to override. And without a 2/3 majority, you can't override anything. So you may get some bad legislation and the Republicans vote against it. And maybe the governor stands up and says, you know what, this is a bad bill. And the governor vetoes it. Well, guess what? If you don't have 2/3, you can't override it. So for override purposes, a 2/3 majority is a Loctite majority, and you have in effect one party rule, which is why I say let's save $200 million a year, have a unicameral legislature, right? Let's just have 75 members, and let's not worry about 213 with all we're paying them and the pensions and the health care for life. Let's just have a unicameral legislature and have 75 members, save a lot of money. And you know what? The districts will actually be a little bit bigger than the Assembly, a little bit smaller than the Senate. And guess what? We'll have coverage of an area, not these overlapping districts. You have Senate districts where there's 2 or 3 or 4 Assembly districts inside it. We're all representing the same people, right?
Right.
Let's save some money.
Yeah, this is a very challenging sort of thing that's going on here. And we'll talk more about the Assembly side of things, which is what you're familiar with, when we come back. And I think what we'll do is we'll have you go over again what actually occurred from a time standpoint, so that people understand what the original law said and maybe why that law wasn't exactly followed. So we'll talk about that right after this commercial break. You're watching the State of Greater Western New York Report.
Through the mists of time, nature and man have both created and buried treasures beyond the imagination. With the ages, these riches slowly dissolve into mere myths until they are forever forgotten. But there are those brave souls who tirelessly cling to the truth, ever seeking to discover the undiscovered, to reveal what has always been there, to uncover the hidden gems of a land thought forsaken but loved by millions. 50 Hidden Gems of Greater Western New York. Discover the secrets in your own backyard. Buy your copy now at 50hiddengems.com.
Welcome back. You're watching the State of Greater Western New York Report. I'm your host, Chris Carosa, and today's guest is Mark Johns. He is a former New York State Assemblyman, and he's telling us about redistricting. We'll get into some other things in a moment, too. But what I want to remind the guests who are here watching, and I see you, if you want to ask a question, I'll relay it over to Mark. Just put it in the chat. I put a little note there so you can do that, and I'll ask him the question that you have. Mark, tell us a little bit about how the Assembly is impacted by this redistricting, specifically how it affects maybe where you're around, what was done, and why those changes were made.
Well, my district was a perfect example. It was 135th, Webster, Penfield, Perrington, East Rochester. I lost by 0.4%. That was the closest race in the state. The other side spent $700,000 to win by 700 votes. It was like a congressional race, only it was for the New York State Assembly. Now, how do you spend $700,000 for a job that pays $110,000 a year? Something a little funny going on there. And, it's all about the big money. It's all about campaign contributions. And they hate like hell when you bring up term limits because that's not what they're for. They're career politicians. So naturally, they're going to design the districts to make it in such a way that the incumbent can win. And it's not a surprise that they took Webster, where I live, and put it out with Wayne County. That's to get rid of me and to get rid of any potential challenger. That's just the way it's done. And if the average person knew and understood this, most people think term limits is the most important thing, or maybe campaign finance reform. But if you rig the system in advance, you always know you're going to win. It's just a matter of how much. And that's really not conducive to good government. The League of Women Voters came out against what was going on. The Conservative Party, good government groups, they all pointed out what the problems were. But the career politicians aren't going to care because all they care about is getting reelected. And they say, well, I must be doing a good job. I got reelected.
So let's talk about some of the practical impact of this. As you say, you were shifted out of your original assembly seat into a new assembly seat. What happens? When does this become official? And when do people have to decide what district they're running in? And can you run in a district where you don't live in anymore?
Yeah, you can technically run in any district in New York State. And you could run in a Long Island district and live in Rochester. You probably wouldn't do that well, but you can run in any district. And if you win that district, then you have to move into that district. And like I say, right now, it's not likely that you're going to do that. I don't know who's knowing that well out of their immediate area that they would be able to run in another district. But, that's what could happen. Other than that, you're basically stuck in a district. And if it happens to be Republican, you got 5 or 10 Republicans all running. If it happens to be Democrat, you got 5 or 10 Democrats all running for the same seat.
So let's go back to the process on how this all came about. So the independent board or council that initially made this recommendation, they didn't make one recommendation. They made 2 recommendations, a Republican version and a Democrat version. So that is not the purpose of the independent council. No. They were supposed to agree to 1. Obviously, with 2, it was rejected by the Assembly or the Senate, whoever was supposed to
both
pass
of them,
it.
Assembly and Senate. Yeah.
But then they were given 15 days to come back with a counter proposal. By law, they were supposed to do that. What happened at that point? Take us through that and explain what happened, and at what point did they fail to follow the law?
Well, you know what? They had 15 days to come back with a united plan. And of course, they had 2 plans, the Democrat and the Republican plan. They shot them both down. Okay. And then they had 15 days to come back with another plan. They could have just tweaked 2 or 3 districts and come back. They didn't bother. I believe behind the scenes, the Democrats told them, don't bother bringing this back. It's embarrassing enough that you had to vote against districts that were somewhat independent. They don't want them to bring back another set of districts and have them voted down twice because, they care about getting reelected come November. And to vote down something that was actually set up to be an independent commission, I mean, come on. The Democrats voted against the Democratic lines, right? They didn't just vote against the ones that the Republicans came up with. They voted against the ones that the Democrats came up with. So you kind of makes people think, and the good government groups and others think, that the fix was in. And then less than a week later, voila, we got all the districts out. And we got a whole new set of districts that don't look anything like those independent ones. And, problem solved according to them.
So now what happens? We have at least one lawsuit, possibly two.
Yeah.
One on the congressional level, one on the state Senate level. Why are they leaving the assembly out? I mean, that's one obvious question. But where are these lawsuits occurring, and what's the probability for success?
Well, I'm not sure that there's going to be success at the state level. We'll have to find out. The congressional districts, maybe they have a case. Maybe they'll redo them. But remember, we're supposed to go out and get petitions signed starting March 1st. And you have to have a certain number of petitions to get on the ballot. So we're rubbing up against some deadlines here. They have to print out, the petition papers and get us out there walking door to door in order to get the signatures to be on the ballot. So time is of the essence. I think they're probably going to push it through, get to a federal court. But the courts, since 2019, the courts have decided that they shouldn't be involved with redistricting, that it's a political process. 10 years ago, they couldn't decide. The Democrats rigged their assembly districts. The Senate did the Republicans did the Senate districts. They kept clashing. We lost two congressional seats. They clashed and clashed. And then finally, time was running out, so it went to a federal judge. And the federal judge came up with the districts we have now, which are actually pretty reasonable districts. So it was only because it was a federal judge, and they decided that the districts should be, somewhat normal looking. Okay. And that's what you got.
Well, it's interesting in the fact that the districts that we see now are just a little, your name's all over the place, Mark. You're famous. The
get the name out.
Well, actually, let's go to that because we've got just a few more minutes left, and I know that you've got a number of ideas and thoughts, and we're not going to have time to get into all of them. So let's start by telling people, give them a teaser, your top 3 ideas, just bullet point them, list, and then let's tell people where they can go to explore it further.
Well, I think real reform starts with term limits. I had a 12-year term limit bill. Now we see Kathy Hochul saying that she's for term limits, but where's everybody been? I am the only member of the state assembly who has ever brought up the idea of term limits on the assembly floor. And it's you're not really going to be held in high regard when you talk about term limits, okay? But I think that's where it starts, because when you know that you're not going to constantly get reelected and reelected and reelected, then you're willing to have maybe real campaign finance reform, independent redistricting. Hey, I'm not going to be there forever, so why do I care about rigging the districts? Maybe we can have some real reform. Legislative equality, unicameral legislature, referendum bill. If these career politicians won't vote on some of our bills, let's let the public get signatures and bring our bills onto the back of the ballot. Look at the nonsense they let you vote on the back of the ballot last November, right? Thank God most of it got voted down. But why don't we bring up term limits and other reforms that the people really want?
That's a good point. And now, where can people find more information on what you're talking about?
Well, I created a website, and it's actually a little bit older now. So you can see that back in 2019 and 2020, I do 1-minute videos at votemarkjohns.com. That's votemarkjohns.com. No one wants to listen to politicians as drone on, so I limit it to 1-minute videos about term limits, legislative equality, even independent redistricting. When all they care about is what they're gonna do to get reelected. Remember, as I say all the time, career politicians, or let's put it this way, the big money, the lobbyists, the influence peddlers, they want career politicians that are bought and paid for to stay bought and paid for. They know what they're going to do. They know how they're going to vote. They know what bills they're going to bring up and what bills they're going to block. Let's have a wild card now and then, I mean, Mark Johns is the wild card. They're not always, I think they all like me, but they're not real happy with the subject matter that I bring up. But I think when you take a look at the polling, just on term limits alone, it's at least 80%. And guess what? In New York City, liberal, left-wing, Democratic-controlled New York City, they have term limits on city council. Think about that.
I just want to make sure, take a look at the bottom of your screen, that I wrote that incorrectly. And where people
votemarkjohns.com.
Yeah.
What a great website.
Well, Mark, thank you. Let's see if it looks like we might have one question here. I think I got across from my email so let me see how I can restate this one. So actually this is a kind of a different sort of question, but it's the sense that the people who are in the less populous areas, who live there, how does this redistricting harm them or help them, whether it be on the state or the federal level? Do you have any thoughts on that? Or maybe a better way to think of it, not so much how does it harm them, but what could be done to give those people who live in the less populated areas a greater voice in terms of their own government?
Well, electing someone like me is a first step, but I'll tell you what, Wayne County and some of the less populous areas, they are overlooked. And when you take a look at when they gerrymandered, it's not just a coincidence that there are more Senate and Assembly seats in New York City and the surrounding area. So New York State and upstate New York has been hollowed out, and the districts, or the district populations, have been centered in New York City. So, we need this. Part of reform and part of what this fellow is bringing up is having people like me and others standing up and pointing out what's wrong. Point out what's wrong, why it's wrong, and how to fix it.
We had another state senator, I think, on earlier, George Borello from the Southern Tier, who mentioned that the way these, especially in the Assembly now, there's some sort of range, like you need between 120 and 160,000 people. And it just so happens that all the New York City districts are geared towards 120, where the ones in Western New York are 160. So if you can in a sense steal several seats. That's a 40,000 people swing. That's 30 or 25%.
Well, it's probably district. It's about 20,000. You could go anywhere from 125 to 145, and they will make the Democratic districts smaller so they can get more of them. And then, like the Webster Wayne County district might be 145,000 or 140,000, and maybe a district that is city centric would be 125, 130,000. So you get more of those districts. And they allow a 5% swing either way. And believe me, they take advantage of it. At the congressional level, you're not allowed to do that. The congressional level is much tighter. So they just gerrymander them. Their pretty much population is pretty much intact. It's pretty much equal. But when you're talking, George Borello is right. When you're talking about the state Senate and Assembly, they're going to pack the districts. They're going to have smaller districts and more of them for the majority, and larger districts and less of them for the minorities.
How do you change that? What do you do?
Well, once again, let's have referendum. Let's bring some of these bills up for a vote. The SOLE Act, single opportunity to legislate equally. They complain in Washington, they don't bring the bills up. Well, guess what? Legislative equality, SOLE, this stands for single opportunity. Let's have people bring these bills up. Bring up the reason why they don't want you to bring up the term limits bill is because they know if they vote against it, they're going to get tossed out of office. That's how popular it is. So let's have, let's have the ability to bring a bill up. Let's put people on record.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. We're out of time here. Thank you all for listening. Those who are watching live, if you want to be a person who watches live, all you need to do is to go to the website stateof.greaterwesternnewyork.com and sign up for the free invitation. You'll get it Thursday morning, and then you can decide what to watch on the show. We cover lots of different things, and if you're live, you can ask questions. But if you're watching this either in our archive on our website, stateof.greaterwesternnewyork.com, or on our Facebook page or YouTube channel, obviously you can't ask questions, but you can still see what the great show is and what we're talking about. So thanks again for being here today, listeners, watchers, Mark, and we'll see you all next week. Bye-bye for now.
Bye-bye.